The Japanese cheesecake. It's such an interesting concept because it's so many of the things that many cheesecakes are not. We're used to seeing them being dense and custardy, but a Japanese cheesecake takes the science behind the soufflé and applies it to the rich, creamy flavor of cream cheese, creating something that's light and pillowy and airy, actually kind of cake-like. It's deceptively light for something with as much rich, creamy flavor as it has. I'm going to make a Japanese cheesecake today, and to pair with it, I have a beer that's also deceptively light, despite how much other flavor it has going on. Duvel is a Belgian strong golden ale that's 8.5% alcohol, but drinks like a light, easy drinking beer. And I think this is going to make a great combination, and we'll find out in a little bit on this episode of Bacon and Brew. I'll start by separating 5 eggs. If the slightest bit of yolk gets in the whites, then I won't be able to make my meringue. So I'm separating these individually in a couple ramekins before adding them to my respective bowls. I'll then move on to my dairy products. To a small saucepan, I'll add half a cup of milk, 55 grams of butter, and 8 ounces of cream cheese. I did add 1 teaspoon of salt in there as well. I'll mix this over low heat just until everything gets melted. Then to my egg yolks, I'll add 1 teaspoon of vanilla and 1 tablespoon of lemon juice. I'll whisk that to combine. And once my cream cheese mixture is cool, I'll add that to the yolks. I then measure out 35 grams of cake flour and 15 grams of cornstarch. And I'll mix that together until all the flour is hydrated. I'll put that aside and move on to the egg whites, where I'll add 1 teaspoon of cream of tartar and mix that with the whisk attachment until it starts to get foamy. At which point I'll slowly add 50 grams of granulated sugar. And I'll continue whisking until I reach soft peaks. I'll add about half of that meringue to the rest of my ingredients. And gently fold to combine, knocking out as little air as possible. Then once that half of the meringue is incorporated, I'll add it all together. And once again, gently fold to try to retain as much air as possible. I'll then add this to an 8-inch cake pan lined both on the bottom and the sides with parchment paper. I'm gently running my spatula through this, trying to knock out any large bubbles if they exist. I'll give it a quick tap on the counter just to even it out and knock out any surface bubbles. And I'll place that into a larger baking dish and place the whole thing into a 330 degree oven. And I also heated up some water, which I'll add to the outer dish, creating a bain-marie. I'll bake that at 330 degrees for 25 minutes before decreasing the temperature to 270, where I'll cook for another 45 minutes. Of course, we want to let this cool slowly to avoid cracks, so I'm going to use a wooden spoon to prop open the oven door. But unfortunately, halfway through the cooking process, we did form some pretty substantial cracks. Now, after learning just how temperamental Japanese cheesecake could be, I looked back at my process and discovered I misunderstood part of the recipe. When making the meringue, I actually took the egg whites to stiff peaks. Now, one may think that the more air you incorporate into a meringue, the better in terms of rise, but actually with stiff peaks, it has more of a tendency to dry out and create those large cracks on top. So I'm remaking it, and this time being very careful to stop when I reach those soft peaks. And again, fold half of it in with the rest of my ingredients. And I find that this time it's actually much easier to get incorporated. Therefore, I could fold it together less aggressively and retain more air. Again, pour that into a prepared baking dish. This time I'm placing a small towel at the bottom of my baking dish to prevent the cake pan from sliding around. And I'm using a skewer to remove any large air gaps. Give it another tap again. And I'm also reducing the oven temperature to 320 this time for its initial bake. I'll cook that for 25 minutes before reducing the temperature to 265 this time for a full hour. And then after leaving it in the oven with the oven door just cracked open for another hour, I find that my cheesecake has risen beautifully and has that nice smooth dome top that I always see. But the big question is it light and jiggly like it's supposed to be? And it turns out this is so satisfying. I could stand here and just jiggle that all day. I'll dust it with a little powdered sugar, top it off with some strawberry slices as a garnish, and there it is, the lightest cheesecake you'd ever find. And it's time to see how the pairing works. So I'll pour myself a Duvel in my brand new Philadelphia branded Duvel glass, which I am extremely excited about. I wouldn't expect an 8.5% alcohol beer and a cheesecake to be one of the lightest combinations I've ever made, but this knife just slides right through this cake. And looking at that interior, it's no wonder they sometimes call this a cotton cheesecake. Despite being one of the most well-known names in Belgian brewing today, Duvel is actually not its original name. It was originally called Victory Ale, brewed to celebrate the end of World War I. But after a local cobbler tried some, he referred to it as a devil of a beer, likely because at 8.5% alcohol, it's dangerously light and easy drinking. So they renamed it Duvel, after the Flemish word for devil. My initial impression is that it's very light and dry and effervescent. You get a hint of bitterness from the Saaz and Styrian Goldings hops, but also a light fruit flavor from the really estery yeast. The effervescence and light dry mouthfeel of the beer helps cut through the fat of the cream cheese and cleanse the palate after each bite, while the light fruit and spice aroma of the beer really complement the light and pillowy texture of the cake. I'm happy I finally produced a good Japanese cheesecake because it's such an interesting concept. You think something that's rich and creamy from the cream cheese, that idea almost contradicts the idea of something being light and airy, but somehow the Japanese cheesecake pulls it off. Now, despite all that extra effort to bake it a second time, I'm so glad I did because the final result came out looking perfect. Alright, you got me. I actually baked it 3 times, but in many ways that's the fun part about baking, the trial and error, the making small tweaks to the recipe and the process, especially with really finicky things like the Japanese cheesecake, because when you do, it is so rewarding. I made it 4 times.